All right, so self-proclaimed America First former President Donald Trump went on a local radio show to basically complain about how Israel does not have the power that it once did over our Congress, basically because a handful of squad members have been trying to impose the very bare minimum accountability that Israel should be facing. So I want to play you this clip, and then we will talk about how absolutely absurd everything he is saying actually is.
Well, you know, the biggest change I've seen in Congress is Israel literally owned Congress. You understand that 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And it was so powerful. It was so powerful. And today it's almost the opposite. You have between AOC and Omar and these people that hate Israel. They hate it with a passion. They're controlling Congress. And Israel is not a force in Congress anymore. It's just amazing. I've never seen such a change. And we're not talking about over a very long period of time. But I think you know exactly what I'm saying. They had such power. Israel had such power, and rightfully, over Congress, and now it doesn't. It's incredible, actually.
Okay, I mean, this is, cue clip of, oh my God, he admitted, because he just said the entire quiet part out loud, okay? He said, first of all, accurately, that over the last, 10, 15 years or something, Israel has had an iron grip over the entirety of our Congress, whether it's Democrats, Republicans, over the last number of decades, it does not matter. There has been a full-throated, unconditional support from both sides of the aisle for the state of Israel. Now, he goes on to say that that is justified. He goes on to say, rightfully so. He is literally saying a foreign government, a foreign power, a foreign state should have complete control over our Congress and the legislation that they are passing. Could you imagine if this was literally any other country on earth that he was talking about here? Imagine if it was China. Imagine if he was talking about Russia, the hair on fire freakout that liberals would be having right now at the thought of openly saying that a foreign government should have control over our legislative process. That's absolutely insane at face value, no matter what country you're talking about. This is a government that is supposed to be representative of the American people, not of the interests or the military interests of Israel. Then he goes on to say that because of a handful of squad members like AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, the other couple that he names there, that because they have been mildly pushing back, and I'm going to give you specifics on how mildly they have actually been pushing back, but because of this mild pushback, suddenly that means Israel is completely powerless now over our government. They've lost all control. Well, let's just get into a little bit of the details here. First, to give you a preliminary introduction to my beliefs on Israel, or how I view the state of Israel, right? As he said in that clip, falsely, AOC, Ilhan Omar, the rest of the squad members who are trying to hold Israel accountable, they don't hate Israel, okay? They don't hate the Israeli people. It's not about that. It is about what are the actions that the state, the government of Israel, the military of Israel, whether it's the IDF, their security forces, etc., what are the actions that they are actually taking, and what are the consequences of those actions, and should we be funneling infinite sums of money into a state that commits crimes like this? Well, here from Human Rights Watch, a threshold crossed. Israel authorities and the crimes of apartheid and persecution. I will link this down below if you want to read the full report. Israel is an apartheid state. It is my opinion we should not be funding apartheid states, period. In fact, not only should we not be funding them and giving them military equipment and aid, but we should be having an embargo, basically. We should be having a boycott, divestment, and sanction to some degree, and I don't know why this is doing that, but regardless, we're moving on to the next thing. Anyway, so Human Rights Watch, okay, again, accuses the IDF, Hamas, of committing war crimes in the latest Gaza conflict, okay? So this is talking about something that was called Operation Guardian of the Walls. So keep that in your head. This was basically this May conflict, as they called it, earlier in the year, in which dozens and dozens of innocent children were killed, and they give a little bit of specifics here, saying that the IDF allegedly killed 260 Palestinians in over 1,500 airstrikes, and Human Rights Watch says that at least 129 civilians were killed and 66 were children. So literally dozens and dozens of innocent children were killed under the so-called Operation Guardian of the Walls, and this is how it should be described as war crimes by Human Rights Watch. They are accurately identifying them to be war crimes. This is how psychotic the IDF is, the Israel Defense Forces are, and how they identify this same exact Operation Guardian of the Walls and the consequences of them. Do they take responsibility for the war crimes that they have committed? No, and this is how comical their defense actually is. So they say Hamas which is this organization within Gaza. They say Hamas embeds its military infrastructure and operates in the heart of densely populated areas in the Gaza Strip. By doing so, it commits a double war crime, attacking Israeli civilians while using its own civilians as human shields. Okay, so this is a very common talking point that the IDF, that the state of Israel, use to deflect away from their own accountability, right? Is it true that Hamas operates within densely populated areas within Gaza? Yes, because that is somewhat of the governing authority in the Gaza Strip, okay? Of course, they are going to be within densely populated areas. That doesn't give you an excuse to brazenly kill civilians whenever you want, okay? That is not an excuse for killing dozens and dozens of innocent children. Period. End of story. And on top of that, they literally call it not a war crime committed by the state of Israel by killing innocent civilians indiscriminately, but they call it a double war crime by Hamas using them as human shields, okay? So this is Israel admitting that, yes, we are willing to wantonly kill innocent civilians, but it's actually Hamas's fault because they exist in the general region that these civilians happen to be standing in. So, whoops, sorry, that can't be a war crime, okay? This is how ridiculous at face value their identification of the system actually is, or their actions actually are. And so, again, just to give you a more of a perspective on the political situation, okay? That is the actual situation of what is happening on the ground, the consequences that should be facing the state of Israel, right? We should not be giving infinite sums of money. An apartheid state that is brazenly committing war crimes should not have control over our Congress. I think that should be the bare minimum. Now, it still does have basically full control, unconditional control over our Congress, and we know that by votes like the one that literally just happened, okay? So presumably Donald Trump was talking about this when he said that a handful of progressives, AOC, Ilhan Omar, the rest of them are, anti-Israel. Now, this is presumably the type of vote that he's talking about here. Well, the House just passed $1 billion in additional funding for Israel's Iron Dome after progressive dust-up. So what was the final vote here? Okay, you had some progressive pushback, but eventually the bill passed by a vote of 420 to 9, okay? 9 out of 429 votes that were cast. All right, this is not a takeover by anti-Israeli radical lefties, okay? This is a government that is still, in a bipartisan way, again, Democrats and Republicans, completely controlled by the state of Israel and their military ambitions. That is the reality on the ground. Now, this was for, supposedly, the Iron Dome of Israel, which many people made the argument, oh, well, this is purely defensive, so how could you be against Israel defending themselves from Hamas rockets that are being indiscriminately launched against Israeli civilians, right? Which is true. Hamas is, you could identify, committing acts of terror when they do things like that. I don't support bombing innocent civilians, whether it's Hamas doing it or Israel doing it, even though verifiably Israel's inflicting much more damage and destruction on the people that are living in Gaza and the West Bank. But that's sort of besides the point on this. So $1 billion, where was that $1 billion actually going? Well, again, keeping in mind the Operation Guardian of the Walls that we just talked about killed 66 innocent children, okay? This $1 billion was not just for the Iron Dome defense system to counter short-range rocket threats, provided that such funds shall be provided to address emergent requirements in support of Operation Guardian of the Walls. So in other words, this money, even though it was not even just for defensive purposes, as you were probably being lied to and propagandized about, even though this was something that was specifically going towards Operation Guardian of the Wall, in addition to revamping the Iron Dome defense system, this money was going to commit further war crimes, okay? And even that legislation, which is $1 billion of your tax dollars going to a foreign military that is conducting war crimes and operating as an apartheid state, even that gets a yes vote of 420 to 9. Okay, and I can't do that math right off the top of my head, but that's like, what, roughly 2% maybe of our Congress that is willing to push back against an apartheid state committing war crimes? That is not a Congress that has lost its, or that is not a situation in which Israel has lost its firm grip on Congress, to say the least. But again, just to give you a perspective in terms of the military aid. So U.S. aid commitments to Israel have increased. You see this over the decades. So, he's talking about 15, 20 years ago, how Israel used to have all of this lobbying influence over the U.S. Congress. Well, we're giving them more money now than we were back then in the 15 years that he was talking about, okay? You see here the funding. We're now all the way up close to $40 billion a year in military aid to, again, an apartheid state committing war crimes with the money and the military aid that we are giving them. So again, don't know what the fuck Donald Trump is talking about. It's just completely delusional. But again, it's Donald Trump. But just to reiterate the point one more time. Okay, the pro-Israel lobbying effort in the United States among our Congress members is one of the strongest lobbying groups that exists in the country. And they say a little bit here on Open Secrets. So they say one of, if not the most powerful international issue lobby is that of the pro-Israel crowd. Well-financed and politically powerful, the pro-Israel lobby is a major force on American foreign affairs that looks to continue America's military and fiscal support of the Jewish nation state. So listen, this is one of the biggest lobbying efforts that is constantly underway for our Congress members. And you see here hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars that are being funneled in to these Congress members' campaigns that then they turn around and give Israel unconditional support for the military equipment that we are sending them. So that is the actual situation that we have. Still, as Donald Trump was claiming was the situation 15 years ago, which it was true back then. But the false point that he is making in that clip is that some dynamic has changed. Nothing has changed. All you have now is a literal handful. I mean, maybe 2 handfuls, okay? There were 9 members who voted against that Iron Dome funding, but, you know, a couple handfuls, we could say, of squad members who are now willing to barely stick their necks out there